All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. Today, Linnea, Sasha, Tadeo, and I are super excited to talk about our Composium, our Colloquium comps. In the process, we'll talk a little bit about our theme, and then we'll also have some time to individually discuss our papers we wrote at the end of the process. So to get us started with the topic a little bit, I'm going to talk about backtalk. All texts are intertextual. They reference the text that came before them, they reference their genre. If not explicitly, they're talking about ideas brought up in the past. But some texts do choose to be a little more explicit and highlight, one specific text from the canon and to dig into that a little bit more. And that's kind of what our theme is about, looking to the past and commenting upon it through author's work. And so I thought T.S. Eliot put it best. He says the past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. So if you think of the existing canon or order of literary works, every time a new author puts out a work, that order is jarred and shaken, and a whole new sense of order needs to be restored. So when an author puts out a new work, the books of the past are altered themselves. So an example of this that was recently kind of made a big splash is Percival Everett's James. It came out in 2024, and he rewrote Mark Twain's Huck Finn from the perspective of Jim, who's the black slave who's Huck's friend in Twain's novel. And so in doing this, Everett absolutely takes from Twain. He uses the plot, characters, themes, and ideas of Huck Finn. And he also, definitely leverages the recognition and status of Twain's original text. To a degree, choosing to revise something from the past is, giving it a level of respect and recognition by deeming it worthwhile of revising. But Everett also really alters Twain. He exposes, destabilizes, and resists Twain's racist depiction of Jim. And he does this through both discrete and blatant transgression of Twain's novel. So a discrete transgression might be giving Jim more background than he had in Huck Finn, but that's not necessarily altering the narrative or plot itself. And then a blatant transgression would be, rewriting that. And so Everett rewrites pretty much the entire second half of Huck Finn. And this leaves us somewhere where, having read James, Huck Finn is forever altered. So this is the body of works we looked at. It's a lot, but breaking it down part by part, we had 4 narrative pairings. So each of these, there would be one older canonical text, such as Chaucer's The Wife of the Bath's Tale, and then one more recent revisioning of it, such as Zadie Smith's The Wife of Willesden. I'd also point out we're spanning a huge range here, going as far back as Antigone in 442 BC, and then all the way up to today with texts like James. We also had a lyric section, and here, instead of talking back specifically to one specific literary work, these texts were more talking to the genre of elegy itself. And so, starting with Lycidas, we got to kind of see the genre of elegy evolve and progress, and each of these authors comment upon it throughout the lyric section. I would point out there was also kind of this cool cascading chain where an elegist would write in memory of a prior elegist, kind of referencing their work. Our drama section was exciting. We had Macbeth 3 ways. We read the play itself. We went and saw a production at the Guthrie, and then we also watched a Bollywood movie adaptation called McFool. And then Ella Hickson's The Writer was this great meta-theatrical play, which is also more talking to the genre of theater itself instead of a specific work. Lastly, we were given some criticism to kind of help us dig in and consider what backtalk means. Spangler and Widdowson were really, they're literary theorists, and gave us the technical tools to do this. And then we also have Lord's The Master's Tool, will never dismantle the Master's house, which I'm sure many of us have read, and that was a great way to also kind of approach backtalk.
Well, before we get too excited talking about backtalk, before we build up too much steam, let's answer the question which is probably on most of your minds. It was also on mine for much of last term. What is the Colloquium comps? I think I know. I don't know if you know, so let's go over for the benefit of the group. So is it a teacherless class? Is it a book club? Or is it, as Winston has so eloquently put it, an academic, collaborative, literary journey in which a group of English majors hone, test, and celebrate their English skills with heightened independence? Or is it just like kind of a good time? I think as a group we found it to be sort of a mix of all four, honestly. It was not only an academic experience with, you know, a pretty exhaustive amount of text, but it was also really an opportunity for us to flex our English muscles and really capitalize on the relationships that we've built up in the last 4 years. But if I can get the next slide, let's dig into the meat and potatoes here a little bit. So I've outlined it for you all with the help of this vaguely feudal triangle. And this whole process begins and ends, I suppose, with our lovely colloquium czars who are seated in that corner. If you would like to look at them. They asked to be called the colloquium czars, so, you know, we ran with it. So in fall term, they provided us the topic and body of works that Winston has just gone over to this group of 8 bright-eyed and otherwise bushy-tailed young English majors. And throughout the fall term, we split into groups based on schedules. We were in 2 groups. We made a few additions and subtractions to the body works that they provided us, and we came up with our own syllabi. And then throughout winter term, for the first 6 weeks, we spent the time reading, thinking, discussing, synthesizing, and doing good kind of English major things, which sound nice. And then, after a structured peer review process, at the end of winter term, we turned in our final papers, and the cycle begins anew. Next slide, please. So to just like really hone in on one particular aspect, which I think is important to understanding our body of work as a whole, these are the syllabus revisions that we had added, and we have one subtraction to the topics of body of works, which Winston has just gone over. And to go over them briefly, so the first pair of texts which we added was Charlotte Bronte's 1847 Jane Eyre and Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea, which is kind of directly speaking back to Jane Eyre, structuring the narrative around the mad woman in the attic of Jane Eyre. And the reason for adding this, well, amongst many reasons, the first one, which I think was most prominent, is because I think we as a group were interested in exploring the colonial, post-colonial mode a little bit more, something which was evoked in texts a little bit like Camilla Shanti's Home Fire. Also, it provides us an opportunity to look at marginalized female characters and how often like mental health is fitting and conceptions of mental health is fit into marginalizing people. And frankly, I think another big reason is familiarity. As a canonical English text, Jane Eyre is something that most of us were familiar with, which made it easier to kind of bounce off it as we looked at the Wide Sargasso Sea. Next pair of texts that we added were 2 poems, Gwendolyn Brooks' We Real Cool and Terence Hayes' The Golden Shovel. I'll begin with, I don't know, the gimlet-eyed among you may have noticed during Winston's little spiel, I shouldn't say spiel, it was a good first part, that every single work of poetry which was on that list was entirely elegy. So this not only gave us a chance to explore poetry beyond elegy, but what's really cool about these 2 poems is it's backtalk through structure rather than just kind of repeating a narrative process. Hayes takes Gwendolyn Brooks' original poem, and while keeping, I think, the exact same truncations and enjambment, and in fact the entire wording of the poem on the brackets, he essentially injects an entirely new narrative working within Brooks' original lens. Also came off the secret menu provided us by our czars. And the final text I want to talk about, and our one subtraction from the colloquium list, was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Victor Laval's Destroyer. Frankenstein, what a wonderful text. After 4 years as English majors, I think we can finally say, thank you, we've had enough. I think we all have a deep appreciation for it, but like, we wanted to go into some new waters. There were also some fear of how we interpret a graphic novel and how we talk about and analyze it within a paper. And then there was also the fear that we were having too much of the English Gothic between Frankenstein and a new edition of Jane Eyre.
Yeah, so today I took you through our syllabus revisions. So like what the heck do we do next? We have all these texts here. We've looked at all of them, we've decided what we want to read. We're about to end winter term and we're expected to come back and comps and like, oh my gosh. So we made the choice to split into 2 groups where we meet twice a week. And so we decided on Tuesday, Thursday, kind of basic class slot times, the 10:10 to 11:55. 5 for the first group and the 1:15 to 3 p.m. for the second group, with common time in between where we sometimes might have meetings where the two groups come together, as we frequently had professors visiting who could maybe only come for one class at a time. So this was sort of to maximize time with professors and also with each other, just be able to share ideas together. So we set out like a very clear, specific schedule, which we have a little screen grab of here. And as you can see, we kind of had a discussion leader, we had a prof we were reaching out to for that day, and then we also have the material we were going to cover that day. So I think this is week 3. If that interests people. This is what our week 3 of winter term looks like. Elegy and the wife of Wilson and back. So a great mix of things. And then something super important was to decide the editions that we were going to be looking at. So we did have a little bit of department feedback for this one, and for most of our novels we decided to go with the Norton critical editions because they have really helpful sources in the back of them, theoretical kind of analyses that help walk us through the text that we're going to read, and a lot of us ended up sort of using in some of our papers. And then the department also very kindly provided us with a great booklet full of all the elegy, poems, and criticism we were going to read. So we all had the exact same material, we could all be on the same page, kind of helping aid our discussion and also just the flow of our class. And then we kind of pinky promised each other that we were going to read all of the novels over winter break, which was a decent sized task for us. You saw the list. I think we were largely successful with this. It was a good time, and there were some instances in which we selected people to read the backtalk version of the novel before reading the original version of the novel to sort of see how that would change our discussion, our interpretations, and just sort of enrich the ideas that we were getting out of these texts overall. And so our individual class days, as I mentioned, we met on Tuesdays and Thursdays. A student was designated to lead the class for that day. So they'd kind of present the focus for what we had read that day, outline some major questions, and they would send us critical articles that we would prepare in advance for the class. And then in our discussion, we took notes. Here's just a little collection of what some of our notes looked like. We discussed these works as a group, and most importantly, we kept a very comprehensive document of themes, which is sort of what we ended up pulling from for a lot of our papers, and also just in our reflection process this term, we kind of go back to that and see where this all started. We have a lot of words that flowed out here, which Sasha's going to explain in a minute, but it was really fun to track these themes throughout. Oh, and the most important part of all of this were awesome professor visits. So all of these lovely people you see up here were people who we had attending our classes, joining in our discussion with their sort of specialized expertises in the different texts that we had. So shout out to Peter and Pierre and Nancy and Arnav and Jessica and Clara and Greg and George and Mike and Susan and Adam. They all were immensely helpful in this process, had just wonderful things to add to our conversations, and I really could not have done this without them. And just a really huge shout out to Adam Lewis, who is our reference librarian, who not only helped us with amazing discussions over dinner during talking about Huck Finn and James and post-colonial theory, but who also was kind enough to be a reader for our papers, who's the only faculty who we were technically allowed to go to talk to, who was allowed to read our papers. So, but yeah, shout out to every single one of these professors. Absolutely, could not have done it without them.
Yeah, so like Linnea said, we kept a running list of themes and we made this beautiful word cloud from that document. As you can see, there's a lot of different stuff on there. We have justice at the center, but moving on to the next slide, we also tracked themes like religion, death, performance, rage, land and nation, deceit, madness, liminality, foils, marriage, and systemic oppression. The thing about all these themes is that because we were working with the theme of backtalk, we often found a lot of connections and what types of projects they were trying to complete. So it was often a feminist project or a post-colonial project or something that kind of investigated the dark spaces of the original novel and brought them into the light. Because of that theme and because of the revisions we were able to make to the syllabus, we were able to find connections that we could build on for our own personal essays. So one kind of example of that is how we tracked madness through the text. We started with Antigone and Homefire, where we saw the Theban and British states frame rebellious women as mad. And then in Macbeth and Nicole, the descent into madness is like the great tragedy of the play, as the main characters in ancient Scotland and in modern day Mumbai try to kind of go for their legitimacy, and they fall into madness throughout the plays. And then in Jane Eyre and Wide Sargasso Sea, this here is one of the seminal works of Victorian feminist theory, The Mad Woman in the Attic. It is by Gilbert and Gubar, and what it does is kind of deconstruct the binary opposition between the angel in the house and the rebellious mad woman. And then we have elegy, which is a giant genre, and it tracks the way that we descend into madness as we mourn, and the way that cultures trying to understand that great mystery of loss often turn to art and ritual to try to understand it. So then after we had that great list of themes, we were able to pull from those and find a lot of those connections to brainstorm for our own essays. So in week 5, we were still reading, but we decided to do some free writes. This helped us discuss our topics with our peers, and then we presented these free writes and got a lot of feedback about, ooh, like I think I saw that theme in this other book. Have you looked at this piece of evidence? Have you looked at this scholar? Do you remember that piece of criticism we read? So that was really helpful, just to kind of get the ball rolling on the writing. We finished all our reading by week 6, and then week 7 we had a hard deadline of a working thesis and annotated bibliography. So like we mentioned, the annotated bibliography was really helpful because we were really trying to ground our essays in the greater conversations around the text that we were reading. Like, how could we really contribute, what was missing, and what were the ways that all the works that we had been looking at could help us get there. And then once we had that thesis and annotated bibliography, we can move to our peer reviews. So this is one of the great benefits of the colloquium process. We completely rely on our peers, and we trust them with our papers entirely. So we really, really value the feedback that they give us. It's not just kind of like a singular read-through looking for like grammar and editing. It's like a really deep kind of grappling with the thesis that you're trying to argue, and the way that you're going about it, your structure, who you're using, and really kind of just long conversations where we're super open to each other's ideas. So for our first one, we did 2 rounds of peer reviews, so we had 2 readers. Everyone was reading like a different set of people, so we involved everyone in our small groups. And then we integrated that feedback. We had about a half draft for those, because we'd only been writing for like a week. And then for week 9, we had a second round of peer reviews. That time it was just one person, so that we could each read each other's essays. We tried to kind of align them based on themes, so that we could kind of really be seated in the discourse around what we were talking about, to understand all the complexities in our arguments. So this here is an example of the first page of my essay that Winston edited. We did our peer review together. It was super helpful. We had questions that we asked each other, and then we also had like close kind of readings and questions that we had as we went along. And then week 10, our final papers were due. So overall, Colloquium comps, we recommend it. We absolutely love this process, and I think, as you can see, it's something that asks a lot of us as students, because we're trying to manage all these different things while producing our own works. But we had some advice for all the future Colloquium students in the room. And my kind of starting one is to choose a topic that excites and delights you. I think there can be an idea that Colloquium is mostly just like a book club, but you're still writing a huge research paper. You're still like investing a lot of time and energy and having this be kind of a culmination of your time in the major. So I really have loved writing about lyric poetry over my time. So when I finally settled on doing that, I found it was so much more fun and exciting to write as I had to grind it out.
Yeah, and my piece of advice, which is something I probably could have listened to while making this presentation, is to be confident in your opinions and your paper. Like, at the end of the day, you are your own harshest critic, but really the backbone and kind of the magic of Colloquium is that A, there's no guardrails, but B, we're bringing our own unique perspectives, and everyone may see something a little differently. And also, like, you're a senior or junior English major at this point, and you probably know a thing or two, so just believe in yourself.
My piece of advice was invite your professors to come participate. I really loved having the chance to get to learn from new English professors who I haven't had in a class before, or to finally get to be back in class with old ones. And it just felt like a kind of a celebratory tour of the English department, and kind of something uniquely special to the Colloquium class.
Yeah, and my final piece of advice is to trust your peers. Sasha really already touched on this, but we are each other's professors in this, and everyone has very important insights to share. And what we were kind of saying throughout this whole process is one person's success is everyone's success. This is something that we do together, even though we submit our individual papers. And with that, we're going to move into our individual essay presentation sections. I'm going to start us off, so we're going to go chronologically. These are the 4 texts I focused on, specifically Chaucer and Antigone, which are the 2 earliest texts in our canon. And so we'll move through time kind of that way. So my paper was titled Who Owns the Story? Modern Revisions of Women's Authority and Performance in Smith and Chauncey. And so I'll introduce you to the 2 women and their words that kind of inspired this entire paper. So first we have Antigone. She's Sophocles' character from classical antiquity who grounds her defiance to the state of Thebes in polytheistic ordinance. And so she tells us, I disobeyed because the law was not the law of Zeus, or the law ordained by justice. Justice dwelling deep among the gods of the dead, what they decree is immemorial and binding for us all. So we can see her separation of state power versus divine power as she embarks on her mission to repatriate her brother's body, which is the main conflict of her story. And then we have Chaucer's wife of Bath, and this is Allison. I love this photo of her. And so she's this kind of like radical 11th century woman who reframes religious doctrine to validate her numerous marriages by telling us, experience though none auctorite were in this world is right enough for me to speak of woe that is in marriage. And so it's really this word auctorite that inspired my paper. And auctorite is the Middle English term which collapses multiple definitions of power relating to political legitimacy, authorship, and moral influence. And the big questions that I'm grappling with in looking at auctorite, which if you didn't get is authority, is kind of what kind of authority are these canonical female characters claiming, and how do their revisionary texts reframe the questions of how women claim authority in public spaces that are already designed to silence or distort them? So the 2 contemporary rewritings that I look at are Kamala Shamsi's Home Fire, and which revises Antigone, and Zadie Smith's Wife of Willesden, which revises Chaucer's Wife of Bath's tale. And so this is my main thesis. Through contemporary rewritings of Antigone and The Wife of Bath, Kamala Shamsi's Home Fire, and Zadie Smith's The Wife of Willesden reveal that defiance alone does not produce female authority. These texts posit that the audience conditions authority, while Home Fire exposes how media circulation and political figures fragment and distort minority women's narrative. The Wife of Willesden demonstrates the power of community to stabilize narrative authority through shared lived experience. Where the path to authority requires a performance, it also requires an audience. Together, these adaptations show that in modern public spheres, the struggle for female authority and narrative ownership hinges on who recognizes it and how. So one of the major theorists that I turn to is Judith Butler, who's a feminist scholar of performance theory. Butler's concept of gender performativity argues that identity is not natural or fixed, but rather is something performed repeatedly through social acts. And the paper extends this idea to authority itself. Authority is not just staged, but it's recognized and validated socially. And this is where Antigone becomes really important. In Sophocles' tragedy, Antigone publicly defies her uncle Creon by trying to bury her brother against state orders. She refuses secrecy and insists on broadcasting her resistance. And so Shamsi takes this model and Antigone with her character Anika in Home Fire, but sort of complicates it. So in Home Fire, she reimagines Antigone through Anika, who is a British Pakistani woman who's trying to bring the body of her brother home, who was associated with ISIS. But unlike Antigone, Anika cannot rely on a shared religious or moral framework to justify her actions. So So instead, she tries emotional appeal. And despite publicly telling her story, there's tabloids that sexualize and distort her image, and so her voice becomes fragmented through media circulation. And so instead of gaining authority through performance, she kind of loses control of her own narrative. And this is at the hands of what scholar Gayatri Spivak, who's a scholar of post-colonial theory, calls epistemic violence, which is the process by which dominant knowledge systems erase marginalized narratives by suggesting the supremacy of their own. And this is in a state that places Anika into the position of the subaltern, a subject defined by a lack of access to authorized channels of representation and institutional power. So in this state, Anika's authority through performance collapses, as she has no audience that shares her common understanding. However, in death, Anika takes the chance to reassert her authority by offering her own conclusion. In the novel, she's compared to an image from Pakistani myth of Layla and Majnun. And this maybe gives us potential insight into a possible avenue for how authority can be recognized. So in my paper, I argue that mythic comparison, which Anika momentarily experiences, moves her from the position of the inaccessible subaltern into a cultural figure of authority by encoding her message into a language of myth that the public can no longer ignore. And so while my findings for Home Fire are kind of tragic, it's sort of that visibility doesn't guarantee authority. This performance of authoritative identity is equally dependent on an audience's authority. There's sort of this avenue for myth as a possible form of salvation, although in Anika's case, not necessarily salvation from death. And so by contrast, the wife of Willesden presents a much more hopeful model and takes the idea of a shared cultural experience as an affirmation of authority a step further. And so Smith transforms Chaucer's wife of Bath into Alvida, who is a Jamaican British woman in North London who openly narrates her marriages, her sexuality, and her experiences in a pub setting. And unlike Anika, Alvida is surrounded by a community that actively responds and validates her speech. So other women echo her experiences in the pub, like in the text that Smith writes, kind of supporting her claims and participating in her storytelling. And Alvida's resistance becomes grounded not only in a community of friends who support her voice, but also in notable figures within a Black diasporic community who act, as I argue, in a similar way to how the Pakistani myth functions for Anika. So Alvida appeals to Nelson Mandela, Bob Marley, Stevie Wonder, who parallels her own sexual histories with theirs to sort of bolster and validate her own experiences. So in this sense, she builds from the original wife's argument in Chaucer by situating herself among Black cultural icons, which I ultimately argue counters Spivak's epistemic violence by locating authority in non-white figures to corroborate minority experiences. And so just sort of wrapping it up, I end sort of with this, not necessarily the question of like, is there a way that women can be allowed to speak, but how are they heard and who controls the story once it enters into a public space? And so I suggest finally in my paper that the struggle extends beyond the characters themselves to their authors. And so by rewriting canonical works traditionally, which are written by traditionally male authors who dominate the sphere, Smith and Chomsky are also able to claim authority over literary history itself. And this is Smith and Chomsky.
All right, so for my paper, my title is The Mother's Tools, The Efficacy of Maternal Power in Patriarchal Worlds. And I decided to look at it through three texts, Seamus Heaney's Very Light Thieves, which is just a translation of Sophocles' Antigone, Macbeth by William Shakespeare, and then the Hollywood adaptation Makbul by Michel Bardouage from 2003. And the impetus for this text was really found in Audre Lorde, which, as Winston mentioned, was one of the pieces of criticism which the czars gave us to kind of establish a foothold. As we're talking about backtalk, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And this is a text which is focused specifically on urging against further divisions within the feminist movement, but it also provides the broad idea that the tools of the oppressor can never be turned against him, that a new tool must be found outside of the confines of the master. And there's a particular Audre Lorde quote from within little writing, which is only within a patriarchal structure is maternity the only social power open to women. Now this is kind of a rhetorical move for Audre Lorde, and she's using it to kind of urge different actions, but that was interesting to me as I was going through our colloquium list, because even though maternity is painted as restrictive and being confined to that role is restricted within a patriarchal structure, something I noticed throughout our colloquium comps list was that mothers and their presence and their absence and what they did really seemed to dominate a lot of these texts. So I wanted to focus in on that. And then if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So I eventually decided to bring this to light through the three texts that I mentioned, who kind of have three major transgressive maternal figures. In Antigone, that would be Queen Eurydice, who kills herself to kind of put the public spotlight on her husband. In Macbeth, that's of course Lady Macbeth. And finally in Macbeth, it's Lady Macbeth's equivalent, Nimi. And the eventual decision was to kind of broadly engage with Backtalk with this idea that I could show an evolution as how kind of marital agency has evolved from pretty restrictive and low amounts of results that you have in Burial at Thebes to a complete kind of societal transformation in Macbeth. So my thesis was where the Burial at Thebes shows maternal agency can only be transgressive in terms of the masculine, Macbeth demonstrates the uniquely maternal can allow for limited agency in patriarchal worlds, albeit only naturally. Macbeth rethinks this potential motherhood, instead demonstrating that its uniqueness can reverse the harms of male hegemony. So discussing some of the criticism which I used for this text, outside of Lorde, most of the criticism that I used was to give historical context, went through older texts to really kind of ground them and facilitate a close reading. So the two examples that I have, first one, hugely helpful, Stephanie Chamberlain's Fantasizing Infanticide, Lady Macbeth and the Murdering Mother in early modern England, again provided me a very stable foothold looking into Lady Macbeth, a character who kind of invokes infanticide and her rise to the top. And Chamberlain's article detailed how not only this is really something unique to women, but also something that was pretty uniquely terrible in Shakespeare's time, something that was seen as disruptive to a patrilineal world, that a woman could suddenly decide to kill a male heir. And then another example was Nicole Leroux's Tragic Ways of Killing a Woman, which provided me some insight into the deeper complexities of suicide in ancient Greek myth, which is important for Antigone, as Queen Eurydice, instead of taking the usual way out for women of doing a kind of shameful suicide by hanging, opts to stab herself with her husband's sword, kind of evoking masculine death. And the eventual conclusion that I reached through these essays was, rather than presenting a kind of evolution by utilizing backtalk, the texts instead spoke with each other with their depictions of mothers. The conclusion, I'll just read it aloud, is maternity itself can often provide the foundation for transgression, even in the most limiting of patriarchal roles. Maternity is not only universal, but inherently non-patriarchal, always offering mother a tool from within the master's house. So throughout these texts, even in the most oppressive of societies, such as Macbeth's Scotland or the Burial at Thebes, I think it's kind of fantastic that this is always something which exists, even though in Lorde's conception that to limit women to maternity is something evidential of patriarchy. And then next slide, please. So to kind of round this out and give an example of some of the things that I talked about and how I interpreted maternal agency, I wanted to do a brief overview of my close reading of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. So Macbeth is often seen as a plot solely revolving around the rise and fall of this mad Scottish king. But what's interesting is Lady Macbeth, who's kind of an instigating factor here, really seems to be doing it also for her own personal gain. She says that her plot shall give to her and Macbeth's nights and days to come, give solely sovereign sway and masterdom, presumably, or a power which she seems to presume to share. And then really something which was kind of the crux of this reading was this little moment from Act 1, Scene 7, a monologue which Lady Macbeth kind of delivers to Macbeth. She says, "I have given suck, and know how tender 'tis to love the babe that milks me. I would, while it was smiling in my face, have plucked my nipple from his boneless gums and dashed the brains out. Had I so sworn as you have done to this?" So again, this is somewhere that I used Chamberlain to kind of establish that within this highly patrilineal world of Macbeth, Lady Macbeth here is essentially saying that she would sacrifice progeny, she would sacrifice a lasting male lineage to gain this momentary power for herself and Macbeth in this patriarchal world. Now, this is kind of where Chamberlain's arguments end, but I wanted to take this up and go a little further, because it seems like Lady Macbeth kind of evokes this dark, fateful mode to remove her femininity and to commit this awful act of murdering the Scottish King Duncan, and I argued that she did this through a uniquely maternal mode, when she is kind of asking spirits to stop up her wells of mercy in her other feminine wiles. She says, come to my woman's breasts and take my milk for gall. This has been read by scholars along with the very famous line, unsex me here, as Lady Macbeth sort of rejecting femininity for masculine violence. But I argue that although she may be rejecting femininity, she's remaining explicitly maternal, still evoking the image of a lactating mother, but she has instead traded milk for gall, the liquid of the liver, which at the time of the Four Humors in Shakespeare's time was evoked with choler, or was related to choler and anger. And the eventual target for this gall ends up being the Scottish King Duncan, who takes on an almost infantilized role as the texts advance. As he arrives at Inverness to be hosted by Lady Macbeth shortly before his murdering, the castle is compared to a cradle and a pleasant seat for the birds who live there, and Duncan is taken on with unusually good humors. And as Lady Macbeth sees him arrive, she knows that he has arrived under her battlements, which I thought was a little interesting thing with the evoking image of a babe feeding at a mother's breasts. So yeah, that's just an example of how I will look through it, and I'll pass it off to Sasha next.
Yeah, so I wrote an essay called Your Elegies Screen Us, Elegiac Tradition in Derek Walcott and Jean Reese's Post-Colonial Caribbean Works. I was really interested in the elegy because it was something I knew nothing about before I started, and I love lyric poetry. So to start off, I have this photo of this from Punch magazine in the 1800s. It's depicting England having its kind of colonial hands upon its colonies. And you can see here in the right, there's Jamaica. I'm focusing my work on the post-colonial and on the Caribbean. So my thesis was that elegy allows authors to process unthinkable grief. Post-colonial elegy gives Caribbean authors a form for addressing the equally unthinkable horrors of colonialism while simultaneously transforming elegy itself. So I was interested, why does elegy work for this? And what kind of things can I do if I apply elegiac structure outside of the elegy and into modern poetry and modern novels? So moving on, I wanted to start with two of the authors that we were given. We had Derek Walcott and we had Jean Rees. And I found a poem that was written by Derek Walcott on Jean Rees called Jean Rees. And it was published in 1981, the year after her death. It's less a formal elegy and more of like a mourning of her life. But in this poem, I found very few scholars working with these texts, so I did a lot of close reading myself. I only found like a few blog posts, so it's not one of his most famous works. Derek Walcott, for reference, he's a St. Lucian poet and also scholar. He taught in the US. He taught at Harvard, but he also wrote a lot of things. And so this poem in particular, this is my kind of annotated copy that I had, honors Rees's Caribbean childhood and her articulation in particular of the Caribbean voice. So Walcott illustrated first in the poem English encroachment onto the Dominican landscape. So English tea browns the jungle and violence spikes the palm. And then once he depicts this kind of Caribbean landscape, he drops Rees herself as a child into the poem. In the fierce hush between Dominican mountains, the child expects a sound. So concluding his poem, having dropped her in, Walcott returns Rees to her childhood, her right hand married to Jane Eyre. So a direct reference to Wide Sargasso Sea, the novel that she wrote as a backtalk to Jane Eyre. So in this poem, Walcott allows freedom for Caribbean voices to fill this fierce hush, beckoning literary creation. Caribbean authors uncovering silenced voices through the mourning of both literary figures and the Caribbean environment itself speak back to colonial narratives that silence Caribbean identities. So then I kind of looked at elegy as a genre. So I was curious about this kind of idea of like nothingness and stagnation. I used Derek Walcott's own essay, The Caribbean Culture or Mimicry. So So he kind of responds to a lot of scholars that are saying that because of colonial influence, there's just nothingness and silence, and there can be no generation of new works and new literature out of the Caribbean. And he says, no, by mimicking these English canonical works, you're actually able to move through them and move past them and create your own things, and create kind of a hybrid Caribbean voice. I also found very few scholars on the eulogy to W.H. Auden, which is what I started with. As Winston mentioned at the beginning, there was like one set where each author was kind of directly referencing the other. So here we start with In Memory of Major Robert Gregory by W.B. Yeats. He was an Irish poet. And then in 1939, Auden wrote In Memory of W.B. Yeats, where he's kind of talking back to the right-wing ideologies that W.B. Yeats kind of views his poems with, while also kind of privileging and uplifting the very personal voice that Yeats introduced to the genre of elegy. And then Derek Walcott writes this poem actually for a memorial. So he presents it at a memorial service for Auden. And he kind of does a good job of explaining his whole legacy, but then he does a turn, and he turns to the empire, and he turns to the post-colonial. And he asks kind of, well, I'm inspired by this poet, and I love this poet, but I also understand that it's because of this poet that I have such kind of conflicted idea of English canon and my own work as a poet writing in the English language. So I turn to the scholar Peter Sachs about the English elegy. He talks about the kind of traditions worked within it, and then Jahan Ramzani, who talks more about the poetry of mourning and the modern poets. And they both kind of say that the elegy always ends in a consolation, where the poet finds either peace or justice by moving through mourning. Both Walcott's poem, and then later, as I applied to Jean Rhys in her novel, perform elegiac consolation. So I wanted to apply the kind of backtalk and the mimicry that I saw Auden making to Wide Sargasso Sea. So here I have a few key terms. I close read Derek Walcott's poem. First he says, in treachery or in union, despite an empire's wrong, I made my first communion therewith the English tongue. So with this kind of quote, he's addressing the inherent wrongness of the empire, but at the same time using the English tongue for his own lyricism. One example is the Antipodes, is how in both Wide Sargasso Sea and Jane Eyre and Walcott's own poem, he kind of depicts the colonial other as always in relation to Britain, denoting imagined or legendary peoples inhabiting undiscovered and inaccessible lands. So he's kind of arguing against that. And he's saying, like, we're not just here to make England what it is for our own thing, but we're also mimicking England. And then we also have the literary elegy, which refers back to previous elegists and the inherited tradition. So the elegy often speaks back in particular to previous poets and talks about the whole genre of elegy. So here he's talking about kind of Auden's own poetry and how it contributed to his own kind of skill as a poet. And then in the second quote, the mouths of all rivers are still and their estuaries shine with the wake that gives the craftsman the craft of peace. So with this final prayer, Walcott achieves an elegiac consolation. He's moved himself, his audience, the memorial service, and the Caribbean subjects through mourning, preventing this kind of stagnation that Walcott was referencing and enabling instead peace. But then I was like, okay, how can I actually apply this to Jean Rhys and Wide Sargasso Sea? So I moved to the anti-elegy. I looked at one scholar, Elaine Savory, who writes about the Caribbean, and she says that the anti-elegy, which is an elegy that kind of refuses to mourn, is something found really commonly, specifically in women's Caribbean elegy. And so what I looked at was, unlike Walcott, who finds kind of peace and in this post-colonial backtalk, an anti-elegy finds justice. So they remake both the life and the death of the elegized subject, often by making that death kind of ambiguous and refusing to mourn. So ultimately, I find that in Wide Sargasso Sea, It reads as an anti-elegy in two ways. So first, Reese reaffirms the death of Bronte and her work, and then brings it back to life in order to kind of refute it. So she takes Bertha's character and she changes her. Then, as a text that makes Antoinette, so this is kind of the renamed version of Bertha, makes her death itself ambiguous, therefore refusing to mourn her. So both of these readings kind of allow for consolatory post-colonial justice, restoring an authentic Creole voice and legitimizing Reese's own mastery of literary tradition. So grafting the elegiac tradition onto the post-colonial novel unites the colonial tradition itself and also the inheritance of looking back at past elegists and their work. So I kind of conclude that inheritance and remaking lie at the heart of elegy. This gives elegy its post-colonial power, it elucidates the consolatory power of backtalk, and finally, the Caribbean author gives shapes to the post-colonial identity, repeating, revising, and recreating fully embodied hybrid voices that rise from the settled ashes of colonial literary tradition.
Awesome. So my paper was called Terrorized in Its Authority, Rewriting the Canon in Lives of Gasso C. and James. And what really drew me to this topic was two characters in particular. It was Charlotte Bronte's Bertha Mason, and then Reese's reimagining her as Antoinette Causeway, and then Twain's Jim, and Everett's reimagining him as James. Both of these characters, I feel like, are kind of not done justice in the original canonical texts. They're rather one-dimensional. Bertha is kind of made the villain of Jane Eyre, and so, but what Reese and Everett do is kind of give them the background and voice they really deserve, flesh them out as characters, and this was kind of a really interesting and grabbing thing I found from the Colloquium. So my thesis is that Reese's and Everett's through the breach approach to colonial resistance is effective, not weakened, but sharpened by its reliance on canonical pretexts. Working within and around the fictional confines of Jane Eyre and Huck Finn, Walter Gasso C. and James, respectively, provide Bertha, or Antoinette, and Jim, or James, with the backgrounds, agency, and voices their pretexts deny them. Thus, both Reese and Everett, as well as their oppressed characters, weaponize mimicry to irreparably expose, destabilize, and resist the colonial frameworks Bronte and Twain built their narratives upon. And so I ground this discussion in post-colonial theory, primarily two scholars. One, Linnea touched on, Beatrice Spivak. She says that subaltern resistance is plagued by the epistemic violence of imperialism and Eurocentric knowledge. And so as long as colonial structures that produce knowledge, representation, and subjectivity continue to operate unchallenged, the subaltern cannot speak. And this, Spivak's essay, is very convincing, but it also doesn't leave the reader with necessarily a clear path towards, solution or resistance. And so for that, I turn to Baba, who generally agrees with Spivak, but also kind of says perhaps the colonial framework is not as omniscient and totalizing as Spivak insists. Baba suggests that resistance can instead operate through the gaps of ambivalence created in the colonial framework when the oppressed mimic the tools of colonial power. So what does this look like in practice? I'm going to talk a bit about dialogue in James. For anyone who's read James, the dialogue in the novel is kind of one of the most jarring things. It feels almost like heavy-handed and overdone, but I think Everett's doing some really important, interesting things. So Twain's extensive use of dialect in Huck Finn is something that defines the novel, and Jim's dialect is absolutely a racist caricature. So Everett instead chooses to narrate James in a modern, educated voice, and black people, when alone in the novel, talk in modern English. However, when around white people, black people signify and use, quote, slave talk. The switch in diction stems from Jim's insight that it, quote, always pays to give white folks what they want. So Everett turns Huck Finn's dialogue upside down while staying true to the pretext of Twain. Jim still speaks in Twain's dialect, but by making it an intentional performance of slave talk, Everett exposes the wrongness of Twain's caricature. So early on in the novel, we get Jim teaching his daughter, Leslie, about this concept, and you can see that he kind of frames it as correct incorrect grammar. Drawing from Baba, we can view Everett's interpretation and rewriting of Jim's dialect as an act of colonial repetition that emerges to unsettle Huck Finn. Jim's slave talk, to quote Baba, or slave talk in James is neither original by virtue of the act of repetition that constructs it, nor identical by virtue of the act of difference that defines it. After encountering Everett's hybrid slave talk, the reader of James cannot return to Huck Finn and hear Jim's voice in the same way. On a less metatextual level, however, slave talk in James is doing a lot of interesting things. It serves a host of purposes that fall under a broader category of resistance. It is a tool for survival, working to minimize the punishment of slaves by confirming white people's perceived superiority. The fact that white people are unaware of how black people use slave talk converts this mimicry from a method of external resistance to more one of internal empowerment. Mimicry in James's American South creates a protective disconnect between black slaves' reality and white people's perception of it. And this disconnect allows for an environment where black collaboration and resistance are possible amidst the suffering and surveillance of white slaveholders. Everett goes on to reveal the greatest power of slave talk, however, when Jim eventually begins speaking normally in front of white people, as he does before killing some of the white oppressive figures in the novel. By dropping the dialect, Jim forces a reckoning of black intelligence and humanity. Hopkins asks, "You ain't no slave talking like that, who are you?" And later, when Jim confronts Judge Thatcher without performing a dialect, he realizes he had never seen a white man filled with such fear. It was not the pistol, but my language, the fact that I didn't conform to his expectations that I could read, that so disturbed and frightened him. So thus, in the final section of James, slave talk transcends from a survival tactic to a weapon of agency itself. Its sudden absence disarms white people, exposing the fragility and falseness of their authority. So that's just kind of one small example from one of the texts, but I think it can help us answer how backtalk operates as successful resistance. I conclude my essay by suggesting that with backtalk, the canon is not destroyed, but is left haunted, terrorized in its authority and unable to reassert itself without also conjuring the voices it once silenced. Spivak asks whether the subaltern can speak. Reese and Everett answer that the subaltern can do something even more enduring. They can rewrite the texts that kept them quiet, ensuring that future readers of the archive encounter not a story told about a silenced figure, but one claimed by them. As James himself writes, I'm a man who will not let his story be self-written. I'm a man who will not let his story be self-related, but self-written. Awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Before you we just wanted to give a shout out to our 4 other Colloquium members. They're sitting here in the front row. Again, this was a whole group effort. Okay, you can clap now.
Sasha, I know you talked about like elegy written in the English language, and I don't know how much you looked at elegy written in other languages, but I'm wondering how different they are from English elegy.
Yeah, well, I didn't really look at elegy outside of the English language, mostly because I was looking at like the kind of British form of like literary inheritance. However, we did have one elegy. If you're interested, you should go to the next Colloquium section, because Clara wrote about Poema para los Californios, which was by Cervantes, and she kind of bridges Spanish and English into one elegy to kind of say certain things in Spanish and certain things in English and different things. And so that's really interesting. I think it would have been cool to look at like Caribbean elegy written in like different creoles, but obviously I don't speak those, so that'd be difficult. Yeah.
I'll ask for the juniors, what would you guys do differently if you could do Colloquium again?
Read the text over winter break. Yeah. So busy winter term.
I think it's hard, but like starting thinking about the writing process earlier on, doing free writes throughout, taking, if you have a little bit of writing on each text you talk about, it'll be really helpful going back come, week 6 to kind of look through those to gain inspiration because, kind of you're left in a spot where it feels kind of overwhelming to pick a topic, but you really don't have time to, debate about it, and you just kind of need to go.
Also use our budget to buy more coffee. we are given like a nice little tidy sum to go like meet in a coffee shop, but we did actually cook Adam Lewis a whole dinner, so that was awesome use of funds.
I recommend that for next
I was curious, you mentioned some like shorter framing text that you use to develop your arguments. I was wondering if there's ever been any other like any thorough overview like back talk over a subject like that in like literary studies that you were in conversation with.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a whole field. Nancy Cho, who's one of our awesome English profs, teaches a class on literary revision, so you go back to our syllabus a little bit. Okay, well, point being, there's a couple of leading scholars in the field who we were introduced to right here. I would highlight, Audre Lorde is incredibly helpful. 2 people I would highlight, also Peter Widdowson kind of gives this a name. He calls it like revisionary fiction. And so that his words are kind of something that we were floating around a lot in our discussions. And Spangler is super helpful. She kind of has like almost an anthology of like what backtalk is and how it works in all different modes across genres, across different forms of writing, from poem to novel.
I'm curious if there were any pairs of novels that any of you advocated for adding to the syllabus but didn't make the cut.
Yeah, we actually had a little list. I think the prominent one was Beowulf. Obviously people know Beowulf, and then I think the 1971 or 73 text Grendel, which reviews it from like the monster's perspective. But we did not end up adding that because we as 8 college students were not comfortable reading like 3,000-year-old or 2,000-year-old English by ourselves. I think there were. Do you guys remember any others?
There's so many.
Yeah.
It's like such a thing to do now. Do you know like Demon Copperhead?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. That's a big one. We didn't discuss it, but so many canonical texts are being rewritten, so it's like there's so many to choose from.
Yeah. Pretty much all of Shakespeare's
All
plays. The only reason why we did Macbeth was because that was the play that the Guthrie was putting on. So, but it worked out really well.
Also the Pool.
And
The
also
Pool's
the
great.
Pool.
You should watch the Pool.
There's a lot of great Bollywood like retellings. There's pretty much like one of every single Shakespeare play.
Yeah, I think the same director as Othello, which is really good
Yeah.
too.
I had a question about your essay, Linnea. I was wondering, there's like a negative valence that you pointed out for like home fire having it be sort of unsuccessful, even though you get that glimpse of myth, versus like how Zadie Smith is able to make sort of a positive spin in community and kind of circumnavigating all these influences. And I was wondering if you thought about like the structure of like experimental theater versus like a traditional novel like Home Fire.
Yeah.
Was that outside of your scope of the essay, or was that something that came in at all in your
No,
writing?
it absolutely came in, especially in my kind of close analysis of Wife of Wilston. I didn't mention this, but it's a play, which it was really interesting looking at because Sophocles' Antigone is a play that gets adapted into a novel by Shamsi, and the opposite kind of thing happens. And so I don't know if I ended up really like homing in on this point in my paper, but I sort of was brushing up against the idea that like this theatrical space allows for that community and sort of makes that meta-theatrical argument of this is both literally giving people a voice and also metaphorically giving someone a voice.
Maybe do one more quick,
Um,
or should we call it? If anyone has a burning question, meet us outside.
yes.